I don't really know how to start shows.
Come on now, don't start liking me now.
So yeah, I'm funny compared to, well, you'll see later. I stand for mayhem!
I know a lot of fucking idiots that think a lot of shit is mean-spirited just because it goes against what they believe.
But the relief of comedy is it takes things that aren't funny and it allows us to laugh about them for an hour.
We got a purple suit to buy and a gigantic coffin.
Why are you laughing?
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Why Are You Laughing? Today, I'm pleased to introduce you to Freddie Prinze. And again, we're coming from the Vaulted Podcast Studios in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, with the whole gang. And I don't know if this is going to be a short one or what the deal is, because this guy lived a very interesting life, but a very short life. Freddie Prinze, if people my age might be more familiar with Freddie Prinze Jr., but I think a lot of younger people don't know that Freddie Prinze Sr. was one of the fastest rising comics and had one of the most meteoric careers of all time, hands down. Yeah. Particularly in comedy, where there's maybe two or three guys that had his level of success at the age he did. Literally, Bo Burnham and Eddie Murphy maybe would be the other two. Pete Davidson, if you count him.
Chappelle,
but no, because Chappelle wasn't that famous by 21, 22.
Oh yeah,
you know what I mean? He was doing comedy, but
yeah,
a lot of guys were Chris Rock and guys like that started young, but never had the success that Freddie Prinze had. Yeah. So we'll get right to it. Yeah, spoiler alert, by the way, he dies. I guess I should have saved that for the end, but we'll get to it. So Freddie Prinze started his career in, again, his career spanned from 1973 to 1977, and yet we're still talking about him today. So he dropped out of high school to pursue comedy. He was from Harlem, New York, and he dropped out of high school very quickly, started playing places like Catch a Rising Star and the Improv in New York, and then went out to Los Angeles. And he is, so, I'm sure you guys have heard many times that Carson, the idea of Carson calling you over to the couch, made your career. And that wasn't 100% true. Gary Shandling was on The Tonight Show 10 million times, and he was a famous guy, but, he wasn't being mobbed walking down the street or anything necessarily. Right. So it wasn't and Gary Shandling's probably a bad example because he was famous. There are guys that did The Tonight Show 10, 15 times that we wouldn't know their names if you said them to us right now. So it wasn't 100% true. But the interesting thing is where that all comes from is the greatest example and the first example of that working to a T so much that it almost sounds made up, how well the Carson call-over worked for Freddie Prinze. So Freddie, at age 19, gets a couple of TV appearances. I think he was on Jack Parr before he was on The Tonight Show. And then he gets on the Tonight Show, obviously, and has a set. Here's the interesting thing about Freddie Prinze, and I joked about it before the show, but I do think comedy was easier in the 1970s.
Sure as hell was a lot less competition.
Yeah. There was a lot less competition. It was, and you know what? There were 3 channels. You know what I mean? Yeah. And less movies being made just because of where you could, you had to release it in theaters for anyone to see it. Now you have 4 million streaming services. So thousands of hours of content come out every year. Whereas back then, it was a lot more limited. So it was harder percentage-wise to make it back then. But I do think Freddie Prinze is an example, and not to shit on the dead here, but he was basically just a Puerto Rican guy. We were talking before, Mike, he has great stage presence, and for a 22, you know what? I shouldn't say that. What he is a 22-year-old whose jokes were not particularly polished. If you heard him today, you'd be like, I've heard this shit before.
Yeah.
But as a 22-year-old Hispanic, who, by the way, we really shit on Carlos Mencia a few weeks ago, but I should note, Freddie Prinze only half Puerto Rican. He was also German, I guess. So
so was Ned.
Yeah, right. So basically, you just had to have a Hispanic accent. As long as your mother was Puerto Rican, you were all right. But no, that was a lot of his jokes were race and ethnicity based. But he was like, he had some funny lines in there and shit too. Like he said that people say New Yorkers aren't friendly, but go on the subway, they'll grab you. Like shit like that. Like, I do think it's funny.
Yeah.
So it's where like, you know, if he lived to be 30, 40, he probably, I do believe he still would have had a successful stand-up career. But again, like I said, it was pretty limited as far as diversity. Obviously, I think there were plenty of like black comedians in the 70s. You know what I mean? Like obviously Pryor would be the obvious example, but you know, Red Fox and a lot of these guys.
Yeah.
But Hispanic, I can't think of another one. So much so that like I think of George Lopez as an older guy. But George Lopez says that he got into comedy because of Freddie Prinze.
Freddie Prinze.
So like that's the type of impact he had where like he was the guy for, you know, Hispanic comedy at that time. So all of that to say that he goes on the
Cheech and Chong.
all
I can think of.
Yeah, I guess. But he goes on The Tonight Show at age 19. Johnny calls him over to the couch. And then from that, he got a TV show. He started touring the country. He was huge. And he's given credit as like the guy. I think we talked about this in the Mitzi Shore episode where David Letterman said, you know, he wanted to get into comedy. And the reason he moved to Los Angeles is because he would watch Carson's Tonight Show and he would hear Johnny Carson say, you can see this guy perform at the Comedy Store, and then the next day they would be famous. So you figured that's the route you go. You go to the Comedy Store, you work on comedy, you get on the Tonight Show. Freddie Prinze, like I said, the best example of that because the next day NBC gave him the show Chico and the Man, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah.
And then obviously he was like a household name. Not long after that, again, 19 years old. And this kid is crazy famous. Even like, I didn't realize, you know, so his catchphrase on Chico and the Man was looking good.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that was him.
Looking
good.
So like both Chico and the Man and that catchphrase have held up to where, at least to the point where I know it.
Yeah.
You know, people aren't still doing it, I hope. but it is a reference that I'm aware of, 50 years later.
Yeah.
So a meteoric rise. And then, let's hear, is the first clip we have Tom Dreisen, Matt?
I believe so. I'm not sure who that is. Is that this guy doing the...
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, it's funny you say that, Matt, because Tom Dreisen's talking, and he's a comedian from that era.
Okay.
And he goes, you know, the thing that, he was kind of telling the Letterman story that I just told. And he goes, you know, the thing after Freddie Prinze, a lot of these guys, the Lettermans, the Lenos, the Dreisens, the Robin Williams, moved to the Los Angeles to go to the Comedy Store. And I was like, the Dreisens? Who the fuck do you think you are? So yeah, this is Tom Dreisen telling a story about very early, I think when he was still in New York, Freddie Prinze.
Did people really start to move to LA after Freddie Prinze went on Johnny Carson and got his sitcom the next day? Did that really pick up steam for everyone moving out to LA?
No question about it. Wherever you went in 1975, like I say, people say, what do you do for a living? I'm a stand-up comedian. The next question out of their mouth was, oh, yeah. You ever been on Johnny Carson? If you haven't been on Johnny Carson, the eyes of America, you just want a comedian. But when Freddie did one appearance on The Tonight Show, and I knew him when he was, a young kid, broke, didn't have any money at all. And he came to Chicago one time and stayed at my apartment. I had a wife and 3 kids. And I finally got him on one radio show, but 4 months later, he did his first appearance on The Tonight Show, and it was history after that. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He had a sitcom. He was opening in Vegas. He was, he was just this rise to stardom. So everybody knew there was a stairway to stardom as a stand-up comedian if you got to The Tonight Show. 26 million people watch that show a night.
I mean, there's no compare, because even now, like, people say Rogan, but, like, I don't think, certainly not the minute it comes out, are 26 million people listening to Rogan.
Right.
Especially on, like, an episode-to-episode basis, especially if it's someone you haven't heard before. Whereas, hey, Carson's having someone on you never heard before, there's nothing else on, so you're still going to watch it, So there's nothing you can compare it to. And I guess Freddie was the first young comedian to get the call over to the couch on his first appearance at age 19. And then like Dreisen said there, now he's playing Vegas. He's got Chico and the Man, all that. But and the reason we're talking about him today primarily is there was a darker side. I think this is the story. There's another clip from that same interview, right?
Yep.
So I think this is the story I was referencing that goes back to early Freddie in his New York days, and this is like, the kind of thing that plagued him throughout his short life.
Freddie, when he came to Chicago, and stayed at my apartment, that night I took him back downtown. He was opening at the Playboy Club for Jonah Jones. And we went to this little bar. He had a night off. We went to this little bar and we were watching a trio play. And I was watching the bar, and we were kids. I was older than Freddie, but we were still new in the business. And he was watching the band. And he looked at me. He said to me, while he's looking at the band, he said, "I'm going to become a big star one day." And I'm looking at the band. I said, "Yeah. We all talked like that in those days." He said, "Then I'm going to go out fast, man." And I turned and looked at him. I said, "I'm sorry. What are you talking about?" He said, "Fast, man, like James Dean." I said, a car accident? No, man. I'm just going to go out fast. And he changed the subject. And I went home that night. I'm laying in bed with my wife, who as I said earlier, playing it. She was a little bit of a depressive person sometimes, too. And I said, "Gee, Freddie said the strangest thing." I was telling her. She said, "Oh, he needs help, Tom." I said, "Oh, what are you talking about? The kid's 18 years old. I mean, he's got the world on. He's got the world in front of him. He's a brilliant young comedian." She said, "No, he's trying to tell you he needs help." I thought, that's nonsense. And then, of course, you know the story.
It's funny to hear how they thought about depression in the 70s, where like the one voice of reason is this lady who, like, the guy said, "I'm going to die soon." And Tom tries and goes, "Well, all right, nothing to see here." He tells his wife, and she goes, "Yeah, he needs help, Tom." And he goes, "Shut up, you dame." No one thought that was odd.
Can I be the fart in the small room?
Please.
And say that story sounds like fucking bullshit.
Well, so that, that brought, my next point was going to be, I just wanted to make that point about, because I do think, true or not, that is how people thought of depression in the 70s. But the other interesting thing I find when people die young is, like, I'm sure you watched the Patrice documentary.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, in that Patrice documentary, there were references to Patrice always talking about dying young that I had never heard before in my life. Like, I never heard that, and I was a Patrice fan. I don't remember that being so prevalent as, like, part of his personality, talking about dying young. They talk about it with Farley all the time. They talk about it with Belushi. They try to wedge it in, and I've heard every Artie Lang story. They try to wedge it in, like, Artie predicts his death every year, and, like, the guy's still fucking 50.
Horse and shit.
So I do always wonder when you hear a story like that, how real it is. But the point is, it did not come out of thin air, I don't think, because of like that conversation may not have happened exactly like that. But Freddie Prinze would do things like play fucking Russian roulette.
Which part are you disagreeing with, by the way?
The fact that he even said
I'm going to be
that.
famous. I'm going to go out fast.
Yeah, like
it doesn't seem like a thing people say.
Little old me was going, "Why wouldn't you believe his wife?"
No,
I don't. That's the part I was.
I don't think Freddie ever said that to him.
Yeah,
that sounds like bullshit.
It does, but again, he wasn't wrong if he did say it.
Sure,
you know what I mean. Like, there was a lot to suggest that Freddie was depressed throughout his life. He was a heavy drug user, obviously, and like I said, he would do things like play Russian roulette. And to back up Tom Dreisen's story, because I don't want to say it's total bullshit, because Freddie would call people. Like, he was famous for calling people late at night and saying things like, "Yeah, I'm probably not going to be around much longer," things like that. Oh, well, you know what? It might be a good time for the J.J. Walker clip. Do we have that?
Yes.
Okay.
Sounds like dynamite.
Well, it was in the end for Freddie. But
his on-set behavior.
Shit.
We don't have the Freddie the Walker clip.
Okay, let's hold off. Okay. Just take me in order, because now I forget where we are. We've gotten off track.
Well, Chico and the Man is an instant hit in 74. This led to Freddie appearing on Dean Martin's celebrity roasts of Sammy Davis Jr. and Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, so this is like a 20-year-old kid roasting the biggest boxer, not just in the world, like of all time. Like one of the most famous guys ever is Muhammad Ali, and obviously at the time, like Sammy Davis Jr. was very famous, and this is a 21-year-old kid, going up there before fucking Rickles, or even like at some of these things they'd have like Clint Eastwood, and shit like that. So like Freddie Prinze is on the same dais as them at age 20, and they said you could kind of always see like a little At least when you talk to him, you could see a little intimidation, but like you never noticed it on stage. Like he was just as comfortable as any 15-year veteran.
Yeah.
And like I said, I think I was probably too harsh about his comedy at age 19. Because he's a fucking 19-year-old. The guy hasn't experienced the world yet.
Yeah.
So like I look at it with the the benefit of hindsight, saying like anyone could think of that. But again, he didn't have any life experience.
Live.
But yeah, Chico and the Man is a huge success. Was it?
I was saying he didn't really get any either.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well.
You kind of glossed over the fact that he guest hosted the Tonight Show a couple times. When he was
Oh, you're right.
21
Yes.
too.
Yeah. And that's another huge thing. We're like,
Yeah, it's a big deal.
I mean, we're just talking about Carson and how influential he was, and 26 million people watching that. Now he's just not just on the Tonight Show; he's guest hosting.
Yeah.
And like, so he's in. You got to figure.
That's
when
some
you
serious company to be in.
Well, when you wonder how different history would have been.
Yeah.
Like, is it him fighting with Letterman? You know what I mean? Like, who the fuck knows? And we weren't, by the time Carson left, we weren't quite at the stage where, like, I don't think you'd necessarily have an upper hand just being, like, culturally different.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, saying, like, oh, well, that might be a different perspective than Johnny. So let's give it to Freddie Prinze. I don't think we were at that point. Obviously, they hired Letterman. I mean, they hired Leno. So I don't think they were there yet. But it would be interesting to see, like, the people talk, at the very least, like that's where Joan Rivers got a show because the success on the Tonight Show, things like obviously Letterman, Leno. You wonder, like, would Freddie Prinze have had a talk show? Like, what would his career have been? Because we only saw him, and now I'm really starting to feel bad for what I said at the beginning. Like, I'm realizing, like, he's a fucking 22-year-old kid who played, a Hispanic character. And the premise of the show was like a Hispanic guy and a white guy. What a wacky duo. You know what I mean? So we were still in the 70s where, like, you had these complete pigeonholing of people.
Right.
Like, he was supposed to be the Spanish guy, the Hispanic guy, the Puerto Rican guy,
Right.
whatever. And, that plagued him throughout his career, which I think we'll talk about a little. But I want to go in order here. So, where are we? Now Chico and the Man is a huge success.
And he's a bit of a wacky character on set.
Yeah, so this is Della Reese, who was on Chico and the Man, talking about some of his behavior on set.
Well, he would hit the wall, and the wall would crumble because the walls in studios are not put up for a house to live in forever. So we would come in, there'd be a hole in the wall, or he took martial arts. So we would come in and he would be jumping from table to table, or whatever his lesson was in martial arts, he would be doing that. Or he would bring something that had no business there, a raccoon, and turn it loose just he was a little boy. He really was. He what happened was he had too much too soon.
So just to give you a taste of how fucking insane the 70s was, Della Reese is unfazed by that. She's like, kids stuff, like bringing a raccoon into the fucking studio. And the martial arts thing she's referencing, I guess he was trained by like a student of Bruce Lee or something like that. And you see that, like, this with a lot of these guys that get famous. Back then, I guess karate was the thing. Like, you saw it with Elvis.
That's so funny.
Yeah.
Where, like, they have to have something. Like, you know what I mean? Like, something at 22, he's already
a hobby.
He's conquered comedy, so he needs something to do, and that was the type of shit. But yeah, I guess he was just a menace on stage, and
a raccoon.
Yeah,
it's actually really funny.
And Della Reese is like, well, yeah, that's just what happened back then. You know what I mean? Like, they would talk like it was what a better time that was when you could get away with. You wouldn't have these looky-loos waiting to snitch on you on Twitter.
Calm down, Ari Shafir.
You could just have fun. Those were the day. Ari's right, man.
He is right.
Imagine like Kevin Hart just bringing a raccoon on the set of one of his movies. Just like,
And just be
hello,
like-
everybody.
And he's like, what? I'm the star. Who gives a fuck?
Brian just let it loose. Hey, where the fuck did he get a raccoon?
Everyone say hi to Biscuits.
Yeah.
Set him loose.
But not only Kevin Hart releasing a raccoon, but The Rock being like, that's Kev for you.
Yeah, he's just a kid.
He's a wacky guy.
Just a kid. Yeah. Kid stuff.
So yeah, Chico and the Man, a big success. He's now becoming And I don't know. So I think we have a clip of Freddie Prinze Jr. talking later, but I listened to a lot of Freddie Prinze Jr. talk, and he said, so Freddie Prinze Jr. is not particularly close to his grandmother, Freddie Prinze's mom, because the mother and the grandmother didn't really get along, and obviously Freddie Prinze's mother raised him, so they were never quite close. But he said, like, whenever he would talk to her, she was very like, oh, Freddie never did anything wrong. Oh, no. Like any stories that would come up about him in like the press, or she didn't believe them, all that sort of thing. So it's the type of thing where you wonder, like, was he always like that? Because he never, like, he couldn't do any wrong in his mother's eyes or whatever. Or was it that he got so famous so fast and had no one around him telling him no that he just became a fucking menace, So what next, Matt?
So after dating Pam Grier for a while,
he was in competition with Richard Pryor over Pam Grier. Yeah.
Pam Grier.
Yeah,
and he got married to Catherine Cochran.
Yeah. So the Pam Grier thing, he dated her for like a year or two, and it was interesting because I guess so Richard Pryor was one of his idols, obviously, and they said. I feel like I'm spoiling a clip I have already, but like he looked up to Richard, obviously, and that really hurt him. Like, Richard obviously wasn't too big a fan of this guy swooping in on his gal, but so like Chico and the Man, like I said, is kind of a stereotypical version of a Hispanic guy.
Yeah,
like, or what that meant, whatever that meant in.
He was shucking and jiving.
Yeah, whatever his stereotypical Hispanic guy was in 1975.
Gotcha.
That was kind of Chico and the Man. And Richard Pryor would call Freddie Prinze and be like, "Don't you understand? Like, Chico means boy. Like, why are you letting them call you boy and treat you like this?" And like that really hurt Freddie, and he was kind of he was stuck in that role. I think we do have a clip of that later, so I don't want to go too much into it. But the Pam Grier thing was always like, he was very nervous that was going to upset Richard Pryor. But Pam Grier was a nice piece of ass back in the 70s, so he didn't care that much. And so good for him. But yeah, then he got with Catherine Cochran, knocked her up, married her, and he made a joke on The Tonight Show, actually, because this was very taboo in the 70s. He said, people do a lot of math around me now because my wife's 6 months pregnant. We just got married, so they're very worried about me. And it's funny that was like a big deal back then. And because I remember when I was watching the clip, Johnny goes, "Well, at least you're married now," as if like, "Hey, scandal's over." So he married her, and that quickly deteriorated. But we'll get to that in a minute, I think. What's next, Matt?
Talking about his phone calls to his friends.
Yeah, so this is the kind of thing I was talking about, where there was some dark shit going on. And if you've ever dealt with depression or alcoholism or drug abuse or whatever, I'm sure you can relate to this, where people don't really know what to do in that situation. And now, like in 2021, they don't know what to do. So you can kind of relate to Tom Dreisen's story. I know Mike says he's full of shit, but I believe him on some level. But like in 1975, if a guy calls you shit-faced and says, "I want to kill myself," you're like, "Oh, come on, Freddie, get out of here.
Have a cup of coffee.
Yes,
sober up.
Shake it off." What are you feeling, the blues, Fred? So what do we got, Matt?
He did a lot of drugs and he drank a lot.
Oh, so this is Jimmy
And
Walker.
he
Yes.
would call you at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And he did a lot of Quaaludes. And he'd call you and say, "Hey, man, I'm depressed." You go, "Yeah, well, I'm sorry. What do we do?" He says, "You got to come over." Freddie, 3 o'clock in the morning, man. He says, "I just need you over here, man. I got to have you." He says, "Freddie, it's 3 o'clock." He says, "Oh, no. It's all right if you guys don't want to come over. I mean, if I kill myself or something, it's no big deal." You go, "All right." So you get in your car and you roll over there. You live right on 7777 Hollywood Boulevard.
Doxing him.
You roll over there. There'd be like 10 people over there. Go, "What the hell is this about?" He says, "Just wanted to see if you come, man." And he'd always pull stunts like this.
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about before, where he would do shit like that. So as much as, it's easy to say, Freddie, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's easy for us to say, like, how did no one notice? Like, this guy's playing Russian roulette and calling people fucked up at night. How did no one say, hey, Freddie, do you need some help? But with stories like that, it is, and that's kind of the pattern of a drug addict or a drunk or whatever, where, like, you get tired of dealing with that at a certain point. It's just human nature to be like, there he is fucked up again. Nothing will go wrong. I'm going to go over there, and there's going to be 10 people, and he's just fucking with me, and it's 3 a.m. You know what I mean? So, like, it kind of becomes a pattern where people like that kind of push the people that are close to him away by being in the state that they're in. And it's no one's fault, which is the terrifying thing about it, is there's nothing anyone in that situation can do. You know what I mean? Like, I don't blame J.J. Walker for being like, this fucking guy again, because how many times are you going to believe it? But it's also hard to blame Freddie Prinze for, like, reaching out and then not realizing what he's doing by being like, because he just wanted company. He called, the reality of that story is he probably called 10 people thinking none would come over. They all did. You know what I mean? And it became a fucking party, and then he just shook it off like, I just wanted to see if you'd come over. But I'm sure it's a much darker tale.
With the Russian roulette, they're like, well, he's not afraid to kill himself, clearly.
Right.
So I better get over there. He's going to do it.
He's not, but then, like, you convince yourself, like, maybe there are never bullets in that gun or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, you tell it. The crazy thing about it is you tell yourself things to convince yourself that everything's going to be all right, because 9 times out of 10 it is. But then the 10th time you're like, fuck, I should have done something, And also, so Freddie's drug of choice, I guess, was Quaaludes.
Yeah.
Quaaludes.
Which were Quaaludes, as we say on the Blind Mike Project.
Fondness for him.
A hell of a drug, to the point where they don't exist. That's
don't
how
make them anymore.
Like, people in the 70s did, like, meth and heroin, and those stood the test of time. Quaaludes, even they in the 70s were like, we got to do something about this. We got to get rid of this shit. So, Quaaludes were his drug of choice. He would do all kinds of wacky things, and then eventually he had a drunk driving arrest. Driving under the influence of Quaaludes. Arrest. And that kind of, whether it's that or that sort of behavior, kind of led, so a month later, and by the way, that arrest was after Freddie Prinze Jr. was born. So now we're in, did I skip ahead at all, Matt? Did I skip anything, or is that?
No, you're right in line.
Yeah, okay. So now we're in 1976. It moved so fast. The guy lived for, 22 years. Yeah. So it moved very fast. So yeah, he has Freddie Prinze, and there's, he went on the Tonight Show after that, and it's amazing. I was at Skank when I was at Skankfest. Joe List was talking about this, where people at Skankfest were on, like, acid and shit. And Joe List is sober, and he said another comedian, Josh Potter, who I had on the show once, he said Josh Potter came up to him on acid and asked him about Matt Wayne, who I'm not familiar with. I think he's like a musician or something. I don't know. And Joe List was like, you know about Matt Wayne on acid? Because, like, his image of LSD is like, whoa. And that's mine too, having never done, like, acid or obviously Quaaludes or any of that shit.
Same.
So it's funny when you go back and watch old footage of a guy like Freddie Prinze on the Tonight Show, you wouldn't think there was anything wrong with him. Like, he's sharp, like you said, good stage presence and everything. He's holding a conversation with Johnny Carson, a legend, and he seems totally fine. He was fucked up all the time, and like I said, he was in roles that he felt like, whether at 22, I don't know if he had the depth to be like, they're kind of typecasting me in this stereotypical role. Like, I don't know if that's what he was thinking.
He was probably just psyched to be there.
He was psyched to get a shit ton of money. 6 months, by the way, or it was around this time, around the driving under the influence arrest, that he got a 5-year contract with NBC for $6 million, which I don't know
back then's a ton.
I don't know the conversion rate, but
that's a shit ton of money.
Quite a chunk of change. And just to have that would make his show on for 8 years.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, like, to have Chico and the Man kind of insured for 8 seasons, that in itself is pretty wild at his age. So he's making a shit ton of money. He's a 22-year-old kid. So I don't know if he had the presence of mind to be like, I'm being typecast or whatever, but he did know that he was, like, guys like Richard Pryor were losing respect for the things he was doing. So he was struggling with that because, he's maybe losing respect from other comics, but he's making fucking over $1 million a year at this point. Right. So He's dealing with that. He's dealing with a drug addiction. He's dealing with depression. So now, about a month after that arrest, like I said, Catherine Cochran filed for divorce. They said this caused him to slip into a much deeper depression. And then we kind of get into the area where he bought a gun. This is confusing because, like I said, they said he would play Russian roulette and had a gun in his office and things like that. So I don't know if this is the same gun that they're talking about.
Hopefully someone took that gun away from him.
At some point, yeah.
Yeah.
But the legend has it, and this is very confusing, they talk about this in the Comedy Store documentary. That comes up from time to time on this show, I know. Very good on Showtime. It's a 6-part series. So go watch that if you haven't seen it. But it's a controversy. So Jimmy J.J. Walker, who we just heard from, and Alan Bursky, who I guess Alan Bursky was like Freddie Prinze's right-hand man. The story is that they were with him when he bought a gun. That's the story that's like told now. The story at the time, which I think a lot of people still believe, is that Alan Bursky gave him that gun, and people held this over Alan Bursky for a lot of years. And it was something there's a very sad video. I didn't include it because it's the quality wasn't great, but there's a video of Alan Bursky at Freddie's grave site, just kind of talking. It's very sad. You can tell this like loomed over this guy for years, and he took a lot of the blame for this. But they say that either Alan Bursky was there when he bought the gun and allowed it to happen, or gave him the gun, which would be worse.
How are you going to tell him no?
So that's like...
Yeah,
I think that sounds silly. Like people listening might be like, "Oh, fuck you, Craig," but like, I think you're right. Where like, hey, it's Freddie Prinze, you know, like
the next day he's going to be not with him, and he'll go buy the
back
fucking
and get
gun.
a gun.
So everyone, shut the fuck up.
Well, it's tough because they probably should have stepped in and said this is a guy that shouldn't have a gun, but like,
you can't be.
Maybe they were fucked up too. Let's not forget it's the 70s, and Quaaludes are in the room.
That's true. But you're not attached to his hip. He's gonna find time to buy a gun.
Right. They're not his caretakers. Maybe he convinced them.
Right, Craig.
Drug addicts are very good at convincing you they need the things that they're getting.
Correct.
You know what I mean? Whether it's money or a fucking gun or your time or whatever, drug addicts are great at convincing you that they need whatever they're talking about. And you're like, okay. Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
So that brings us to January of 76 or 77?
77.
January 77, he is making a few of these phone calls, and he calls Catherine Cochran, who he kept, in touch with, obviously, the mother of his child. Called her, made some depressing comments, and then called his manager. What's his name again, Matt?
Dusty Snyder.
Yes, Marvin Dusty Snyder. Called his manager. Manager comes over to the hotel room that Freddie was staying at, and while Marvin was in the room, Freddie shot himself with the gun that Alan Bursky either gave him or saw him purchase. So it's tough because he was telling a lot of people that this was going to happen or that he wanted to do this, or at the very least firing a gun at his head to make people laugh or to make people cringe, whatever it was that those Russian roulette things were about. So, it's a very sad story, and it's a great example of what fame can do to you, can do to a person. Because I believe a lot of the depression comes from, obviously a lot of it is drug addiction and whatever trouble he was going with in his personal life with his wife and things like that. But I do believe a lot of it is what was happening in his career where he had too much money way too fast. He was allowed to do things like bring a fucking raccoon into the studio, which we probably glossed over a little too quickly.
Nobody batted an eye.
So he could do whatever the fuck he wanted. He was a kid with a ton of money that was never being told no, and struggled with depression, which, an inherent depression, I'm sure, as well, but also depression from things like the Richard Pryor thing that I talked to you about. So we have a clip. What's the next clip? The Freddie Prinze?
Freddie Prinze Jr.
Yeah, so this is pretty interesting. Freddie Prinze does a podcast with Josh Wolf, I think, KFC's boy, who's a comedian. And he's a pretty interesting guy. Also, side note, Freddie Prinze is a guy, if you go watch his old stuff, like watch his early appearances on Leno, who, by the way, I guess Leno was like roommates with, I think that comes up here. but Leno was roommates with Freddie Prinze. So you go watch Freddie Prinze's early like Tonight Show appearances and stuff, and he's like, "Hey guys, how you doing?" And now listen to his listen to how gruff his voice is. But this is Freddie Prinze Jr. Talking about his dad, who was only around for 1 year of Freddie's life.
My dad hated being on Chico and the Man. He hated it. Chico meant boy. And Richard Pryor would call him every night and be like, "You don't let them call you boy? Do you understand how disrespectful?" And Richard was the one who discovered my dad. Like, he was my dad's hero. Even though they had beef because of Pam Grier, because Pam picked my dad instead of Richard, it killed him that Richard didn't respect him. It killed him that Richard would give him all this heat for this, right? But my dad didn't know how to say no. It was just yes, yes, yes. He was working 5 days a week on Chico.
But also, man, I know that Chico means boy, but the opportunity for Latinos to see somebody...
He got hated on by other Latinos, so he couldn't get love there, because Mexicans were like, "Fuck you, you're Puerto Rican." It's like, yo, white people think we're all the same, man. You got to send love to anybody speaking Spanish. You need to love. But he was working 5 days on Chico. That night he was doing all the local clubs, and then on the weekends he had the Vegas gig, or he had to go here, he had to go there. It was 7 days a week, every single day for 2 years straight.
It's sad. It's similar to when I had Anthony DeVito on. We talked about Chris Rock and how a lot of like black people lost respect for Chris Rock after the N-word bit, like black people versus N-words, because it kind of gave like racists an excuse to use that sort of logic, and Chris Rock struggled with that for a little while. It's similar and dissimilar, but it's similar in the sense that, like Josh Wolf's mindset is like, hey, he influenced, like George Lopez said, that Freddie Prinze Jr.'s dad is the reason I got into stand-up, and that's Josh Wolf's mindset. But as like white guys, we don't really deal with the weight of a race on your shoulders, particularly in 1975, where there were no other like Latino figures in comedy, really.
Yeah.
So it's something he struggled with a long time, and obviously it ended disastrously. So it's hard to say. I mean, like as far as influences, like I said, like them or not, George Lopez, probably Carlos Mencia. Although I don't know if anyone really influenced Carlos Mencia as much as the people he took jokes from.
Everyone influenced Carlos Mencia.
In their own way, yeah.
Depends on what your definition of the word influence is.
Yeah. But Freddie kind of influenced an entire generation to get into comedy, and like there was a movie made about his life shortly after and things like that. Very very sad story. But it's Is there any other audio clips? I forget.
There's one more clip with Freddie Prinze Jr.
So let's hear that.
You have to have someone like that. My old man didn't have anybody like that, and they were seeing his talent as a huge opportunity to make money. Not in a bad, gross way, although I'm sure there were some people in that circle, but there were also other people that just thought he could handle it because he wasn't very honest with people. He was even with like Jay Leno, who was his closest friend. Jay's told me before, he's like, there were nights where I literally felt like I never even knew him. He was just like, I would talk to, they were roommates out here in LA trying to make it when they were both broke.
Yeah.
And he's like, he would come home and I just wouldn't even know who he was.
Because he didn't know who he was.
He had no idea, and this business defined him.
Yeah. Yeah. So then they go on to talk about, it's actually an interesting segment from that. I don't know what that show that is, whatever Josh Wolf and Freddie Prinze do together. But it's very interesting to hear them talk about that, because it's like, and the industry does this to you a lot. If you aren't able to break out of a role, what was interesting is he goes on to talk about the example he used was what's his name, Daniel Radcliffe, the kid that played Harry Potter.
Harry Potter.
Yeah. He's talking about like choices Daniel Radcliffe is making now that have nothing to do with Harry Potter. Obviously, he tries to stay away from that role and everything. And he says he's doing all that so that when he's 40, hopefully he can have a role where people don't say, hey, that's Harry Potter. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So a lot of young people struggle with that, where it's like, oh, fuck, every role I'm going to get is like looking good. Like that's going to be me forever now.
Yeah.
And that's what Hollywood does to you because, and this is less true now with just the amount of streaming services and people being able to put out their own shit on YouTube or wherever else, patreon.com/blindmike or wherever. But with people, it's not as prevalent now. But it still is where, like, the go-to example I always use is Tim Dillon. where Tim Dillon right now is one of the biggest voices in comedy, in my opinion. And he's like the highest paid guy on Patreon and all that. And you would think networks or some media outlets or Netflix or whoever would see that and say, we have to capitalize on this. Because, A, Tim Dillon's one of the biggest names in comedy, and he's gay. Like, he's a role model. We claim to want to have all these role models for whether it's gay people or minorities or whatever. We want to have a voice for them. Well, Tim Dillon's the most unique voice. Like Craig just said, no one knows he's gay. Really.
I didn't know that.
You don't.
Oh, you didn't?
No.
Yeah,
So
you don't. You
so
wouldn't
hate him now?
All right, relax.
What is that?
Jesus.
No. Idiots.
So you wouldn't know. Like, why would you? But the industry doesn't want someone like that. You know what I mean? Like, as much as they say they want diversity, what they would prefer...
Or they want to normalize
They want
things.
the flamboyant
They would prefer Tim Dillon comes sashaying in and talks about fashion and this and that. And, like, they don't want Tim Dillon to be a gruff guy who isn't necessarily a far-left liberal,
Right.
So they don't respect him. And that's kind of what Freddie Prinze was doing, and he's one of the better examples of that because he had such a meteoric rise, and in part... killed himself because of it. Now, there's a lot of like gray area where like did Freddie Prinze kill himself? The mother that I referenced earlier, Freddie Prinze's mother, won a lawsuit in order to get some type of like life insurance payout or something, saying it was not a suicide because he was prescribed Quaaludes. And basically said these fucking idiot therapists, they gave him Quaaludes. He's under the influence of Quaaludes. So good for her for calling that out.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, right.
The current opioid epidemic.
Yeah, right. So it is, it was ruled at least, what would that be, like civilly, not a suicide?
Yeah.
But there was a suicide note. He wrote a suicide note. So,
Jesus.
But then even that's questioned because he would do things like call people up and say, I'm going to fucking kill myself. And then they'd go to his house and he'd be having a party. So people are like, did he write that meaning to kill himself that day? Or was it something he just wrote for shits and giggles or not necessarily to use that day or whatever? But there was a suicide note. He was under the influence of Quaaludes. So no one really knows if he killed himself. Freddie Prinze Jr. maintains he didn't mean to. He was just under the influence of drugs, which I tend to believe that because even if he purposely shot himself out of depression, the fucking Quaaludes didn't help. And if he was in the right state of mind, he would not have done that.
Is there any rumor mill that Dusty Snyder actually killed him?
I don't think so. Is there? I don't know about that.
I think he went to a room. He went to a room by himself and he shot himself.
But what would be the motivation?
I don't know.
Yeah, I was looking that up, and I don't think there's any motivation because he died 6 months. He killed himself 6 months after signing that $6 million contract for 5 years. So it's like his manager is like, he wants, like, after 5 years, he wants more.
Yeah, I'm not saying that.
I don't know if those exist. I'm not aware of them, and I don't see why that would happen.
I was just curious.
If they're both fucked up, who knows?
Also, the suicide note was in Harry Cohn's handwriting.
A callback to a previous episode. Harry Cohn had his fingers all over this one.
Anyway, tragedy.
Oh God.
Yes, no, very, very, very sad story. The story of Freddie Prinze, but a lesson teacher to how shitty the industry is and how shitty fame is in general. And I do think we've curbed that a little bit, but like we're still at a time in history where like the Britney documentary will come out and people will be like, can you believe how the paparazzi treated Britney? And then someone tweets something and we're at their fucking doorstep calling for them to get fired and ruin their life. So we haven't really changed that much.
Yeah, it's harder to hide now.
Yeah.
That's the only thing.
Yeah, right. But yeah, I don't know. Any other thoughts on Freddie Prinze before we get out of here?
No.
One of our
rest in peace, sweet Prince.
One of our shorter. Oh, that's the other thing I didn't mention is he went by Freddie Prinze. Probably because his last name is not particularly Hispanic sounding. But he said that it's funny how like time works because I guess he told David Brenner he wants to be the king of comedy. And they said, well, that's already taken by Alan King, who I'm not really familiar with. And he said, all right, I'll settle for Prinze. And he legally changed his name to Freddie Prinze. And Alan King, I don't know who the fuck that is. So Freddie Prinze won out on that one at least. But yeah, like I said, one of our shorter episodes, but there wasn't.
Yeah.
He led a fascinating life, but not a very long one. He was only in comedy for 3-4 years, and then sadly took his own life. So yeah, like I said, for more on that, go the Comedy Store documentary. They got about. I think we actually might have gotten more in depth than they did on it because it was only part of an episode. But it is interesting to just kind of note the impact that Freddie Prinze had historically. And other than that, make sure, speaking of suicide, make sure you listen to a very good show. And we'll all kill ourselves. It'll be like Jonestown. We all listen to a very good show. No one's laughing, which makes me uncomfortable at that.
I smiled and waved at the camera. I was adding to it. I smiled and waved.
Hey, maybe the next episode is they've got bigger plans than I realized. I spoiled it. And of course, we record this at Vaulted Podcasts in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Anything you want to film or record, music videos, short films, movies, podcasts, whatever, hit up Matt from RI on Twitter. Or go to Vaulted Podcasts RI, as in Rhode Island.com. And guys, please, if you're a fan of this, we've gotten rave reviews, by the way.
Yeah.
Historically, I don't know how this played out. Maybe we've taken a real downturn in the episode since then.
True.
But at least at the time of recording this, people seem to love the Patrice O'Neill episode.
Yeah.
Yep.
So hopefully you guys are still enjoying it. And if you want to get episodes a week early, as well as all the other Blind Mike Project content and more on money and all of that, go to patreon.com/blindmike. We've got merch up as well, like this hoodie I'm wearing. I should probably stop drawing attention to that because now people are going to think I wear this every episode. It's all recorded in one day. Don't judge me, you fucks.
Yeah.
But go to the store, go to our link tree. That's where you can find all the links, Spotify, iTunes, all that shit, as well as the merch store. So go to Blind Mike Project on Linktree, and we'll talk to you guys next time on Why Are You Laughing?